Welcome to Countdown to Decision 2024. I'm Joseph Backholm, and this is where we talk about what's happening in the election and figure out how you can be the best steward possible of the authority that God has given you in the opportunity and the moment that we have in 2024. I'm Joseph Backholm, and once again, I'm joined by my co-host, Alison Centofante. Hi, Alison.
Hey, Joseph. So excited for today. We've got an amazing guest with us, guys. It's Allie Beth Stuckey. I would say one of the preeminent, if not the preeminent voice in women, conservative Christian narrative and politics. She is the host of the Relatable podcast. She's an author, a writer, a mom herself. And we're going to talk to her today about how this concept of toxic empathy, as she has coined, is influencing our political discourse. You know, the implications for issues like immigration and abortion are affecting our country and why it's essential for us to speak our voice now. Allie, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, so let's just get right into this. We are weeks out from November 5th, and every year, and every election season we hear this is the most important election of our time. But we're hearing Christians on both sides say, I'm figuring out who to vote for. I'm figuring out if I even want to vote. They're looking at personalities. They're looking at politics. How are you thinking about this election?
What policies do they represent? It's a set of policies versus a set of policies. And when I look at Trump's policies, I see policies that I believe are going to lend themselves to more order, more security, more stability, more safety, and more freedom in the right ways, in the constitutional ways. And then when I see Kamala Harris's policies, I see policies that promote institutionalized degeneracy, chaos, lawlessness, instability, both globally and nationally. So when I think of politics as a vehicle, not the primary or exclusive, but a vehicle to love my neighbor, I want to think about policies that are going to lead to order and security and stability and flourishing for my neighbors, their kids, their grandkids, for my own children and grandchildren. And when I look at Donald Trump's policies on economics and immigration, I see policies that I think are going to lend themselves more to the well-being and safety of my neighbors than Kamala Harris's policies. So that's one way that I'm thinking about this election.
Yeah. Allie Beth, you mentioned there just kind of the evaluation that we have to go through as voters is what's going to be good for people. And people don't evaluate that question in the same way. There's this concept called toxic masculinity that we've heard a lot about recently, where it's like, well, masculinity is a good thing, but then there's this kind of extreme toxic version of it that actually becomes problematic. And we're not going to dig into that, but we recognize that that concept at least exists. You can be masculine or quote unquote in a way that's not actually helpful. I don't know if you've coined this term, but you're about to release a book on toxic empathy. Now, this is, I think, introducing an issue of first impression for a lot of people where there's something good, empathy, I want to care about people, but you are suggesting there can be a toxic and therefore not helpful version of this. Develop that concept for us a bit and then tell us how you think that impacts our voting decisions.
Yes, I'm certainly not the first person to talk about the harms of empathy. I think I probably coined the phrase toxic empathy. I can't say it's never been used by anyone, but I hadn't seen it. It's just the concept of empathy being used as a tool of emotional manipulation, specifically to get women to be progressive. That's what this book is about. It could manifest itself, I guess, in a variety of ways. But my argument is that the media, progressive activists, will use someone's natural inclination towards empathy. Meaning, I put myself in someone else's shoes and I feel what they feel. I see what they see. To convince the person that the only compassionate and righteous position on a particular subject is the progressive one. So I can give an example of what that looks like just so people understand what this means concretely. We go through in the book 5 subjects in which I see this used most prominently. That is abortion, that's gender, so-called gender identity, that is sexuality in the definition of marriage, that's immigration, and that's what's typically referred to as social justice. These are the 5 issues in which I see women being manipulated by what I call this toxic empathy. So if we look at abortion, there was this story that was published by NPR a couple of years ago. This was in the wake of the Dobbs decision, where they told this really sad seeming story of this woman named Samantha. She lived in Texas. She was having her 9th baby. And at the 20-week ultrasound, she found out her baby had a life-limiting diagnosis, trisomy 18. And she wanted to have an abortion. But in the state of Texas, she couldn't have an abortion. The laws there say that this is not a reason to abort your baby. And so she was forced, according to this NPR article, to give birth to her baby at term, and her baby, Halo, died in her arms. And the way NPR tells this story is that Samantha was forced to have this baby. She was forced to go through this grueling, anxiety-ridden pregnancy, that she was forced to give birth to a child who only suffered in her short life, that she was forced to watch her baby die. She was forced to pay for a funeral when she was already a poor mother of 8 living in a trailer. And so they've hoisted up Samantha as the only victim in this story, as a victim and as the only victim in this story. And the purpose is to get women to see how these pro-life laws are unempathetic. They lack compassion. They are cruel. They're callous. They're draconian. The point is to pull our heartstrings only for Samantha, to only see her perspective, to only see her plight, and for us to completely ignore who is actually victimized by abortion, which is Halo. You're not supposed to think about that. You're not supposed to think what happens in an abortion. You're not supposed to think, well, what would have happened to this child if she had been aborted at 20 weeks? What does an abortion at 20 weeks look like? Does that child feel pain? And wait, we're talking about a living, breathing, moving human being that you're killing. Toxic empathy bids its readers, or bids its, the person on the other side of the conversation, to ignore the whole story, to ignore the other side of the moral calculation, to only put yourself in the shoes of the person that they have hoisted up as the victim, whether it is the man who they say is trapped in his own body and wants to be a woman, wants to be affirmed by going into the women's locker room, whether it is the illegal immigrant who crossed over the border for a better life, whether it is the woman who has finally felt liberated by her sexual awakening when she is 32 and wants to divorce her husband and marry a woman. These are all the people that we are supposed to feel empathy for. And toxic empathy says that in order to be a good person, you have to affirm them, affirm their choices, and vote in a way that makes sure that they continue to have the freedom to make the choices that make them happiest. And of course, my argument is that actually going that direction is unloving, unkind, and ultimately harmful.
That's such good examples, Allie, because right now we're seeing this discourse of, I want to vote for the nicer person who I think is nicer to minorities or women because of their policies. And I jokingly used toddler talk with a friend, a neighbor who said that. And I said, I think you're better than that. You should care about the women who want to fight for life. What about the women in my womb? What about the criminals that come across the border and take the lives of moms like me on a hike? Think of that as well. So how do we know when we've crossed the line from empathy, which is okay to feel, hey, you're in a hard situation, your kid has a bad prenatal disorder diagnosis. What's that line from good empathy to toxic empathy?
Yeah, so Abigail Schreier, in her book, Bad Therapy, she talks about this too, and she makes a really brilliant point that I love. She says that empathy in itself is neither good nor bad. Empathy is neutral. If I feel what you feel, that in itself isn't necessarily virtuous. It can lead you towards virtue or not. Because if I feel what someone else feels, their feeling may or may not be justified. It may or may not be right. So if a man who says that he's a woman, if I feel their confusion, and that feeling of their confusion, if I am trying to understand what it's like to think that you're in the wrong body, that may lead me toward affirmation of something that is not true, affirmation of something that is ultimately harmful for that person and for the community around him. And affirmation, most importantly, of sin, of something that is not biblical. So when empathy leads you to affirm something that is not true, that is immoral, that is unbiblical, that is toxic empathy. Now, I tell a story at the beginning of the book about how when I was traveling before I had kids and there was a crying baby on the plane, of course, the first thought is, oh my goodness, why is there's a crying baby on the plane? Like, I get my headphones in. This is so aggravating. I just want to be able to focus, whatever. Well, now after I've had babies and I've gone through that many times myself, every time I see a mom traveling, especially if I happen to be by myself, which is rare, but if I happen to be by myself and I see a mom traveling, she's lugging that stroller, her baby is screaming, the last thing that I'm thinking is frustration. I'm thinking, how can I help you? And I know that mom wants more than anyone else on the plane for her baby to stop crying. And because I have been there, because I can feel what she feels, that changes how I react. Like, that changes how I treat that woman. So in that case, feeling what she feels can lead me towards something that is virtuous, which is helping, which is meeting someone's need. So empathy can certainly lead us towards love. It can lead us towards things that are good, but it can also lead us towards things that are harmful, which means that empathy, when it is not in submission to biblical truth, it becomes a problem, because empathy in itself is not a good guide. It is not a moral arbiter. It can't tell us what's true or false. It can't tell us what's right or wrong. It can only tell us what someone feels, which can only get us so far. If we feel what someone else feels, the question is after that, but what is true? Because on all of these issues, whether it's illegal immigration, like we can talk about the woman who fled, Colombian violence with her family and came over here and wants to stay and work hard. But on the other side of that conversation, we can talk about Lake and Riley. We can talk about Kate Steinle, the people whose lives have been lost because of crimes committed by people who should not have been here. At the end of the day, we've got all of these competing anecdotes, these competing stories of empathy. So the question for the Christian is, but what is true? What is true? What is factually true? What is scientifically true? Most importantly, what is biblically true? So on that subject, what does the Bible say about borders? What does God tell us about himself? What do we read in the Old and the New Testament that lends itself, that informs how we should think about countries, how we should think about security, how we should think about borders? So that's kind of my argument, is that Christians are called to love, not just empathy. And love for the Christian, 1 Corinthians 13:6 tells us, rejoices only in the truth, never in wrongdoing, but only in the truth, which means that true love, loving our neighbors, loving the people around us, has to be inextricably intertwined with truth, not just how we feel or how someone else feels.
Allie, you make a really important point there, because we're aware of the fact that we live in a world where our truth, or our feelings now, are the source of truth for us as individuals. And if we feel something, then it is true. But it seems that the way toxic empathy is operating, as you've described it, is that when I feel something, it's not just true for me, it's true for you as well, and that you demonstrate you're a good person by acknowledging that my feelings determine truth for me and everyone else, and you have to acknowledge that. Is that a fair description of what we're dealing with?
Yes, absolutely. And the problem is that when you're talking about a policy or you're talking about a subject, you've got a lot of different people involved with a lot of different feelings. And so that is one part of empathy, is that if you have hyper-focused empathy on one person, and that's kind of the nature, not just of empathy, but also of ourselves, like we don't have the capacity to feel empathy for every single person all at once. Like, how do you feel equal empathy for two people whose desires and priorities are competing against each other? We actually cannot. We don't have the emotional ability to do that. And so that's why empathy, when you hear these words, especially in regards to when it comes to like justice and our justice system, we hear empathy has to lead you. Well, it can't, because I might have empathy for the person who committed this heinous crime that had a really hard upbringing and a really hard life and has had, a bad hand dealt to him. But I also have empathy for the child or the woman that he victimized. So at the end of the day, I have to say, what is true? What is right? Because think about if a judge was motivated by empathy. You don't want a judge to be motivated by empathy. You want a judge to be motivated by the truth. And that's why I think, like, when we look at God's doling out of justice for Old Testament Israel, that's not to say we're applying all of the laws of the Old Testament to America here today, but we can see God's principles of justice. And we see over and over again in the Old and the New Testament, God say that he hates partiality, that he loves impartiality, that in truth you should judge your neighbor. You don't defer to the poor. You don't defer to the great. In other words, you're not motivated by how you feel about someone, even your desire to help the underdog. You're motivated by what is true in that case. The danger of empathy and toxic empathy is that it can blind us to both reality and morality.
Allie, why is that not cruel and cold-hearted? To tell people you just, you're going to feel something, you might feel sad for them, but you got to learn to ignore the fact that you feel sad for them and just put it away, and that's their situation, and we're just going to we're going to operate on different principles other than the fact that they're in a difficult situation. Why is that just not cruel?
It's not ignoring that feeling. It is informing your feelings of what is true. And so you might feel sad for the person who maybe had a hard upbringing and just committed this crime that is going to land them in prison. And you might think, gosh, I really wish that they had been loved in their upbringing. I really wish that they had a stable home. I really wish that they had a mom and dad. But at the end of the day, we know what justice looks like, and it has to be rooted in truth. And that is true love. Loving your community, loving those around them cannot be separated from how God defines things. It can't be separated from the truth. It can't be separated from God's definition of justice, because God is love, 1 John 4:8, and whatever he says is true or false or right or wrong or just or unjust. Those definitions are what informs us of how to love someone. And I think that a lot of times Christians think, or people think, like we can outlove God, or we can out nice God, or we should kind of let God off the hook, especially when it comes to like gender and sexuality. Like we think that we can love people better by ignoring Romans 1. We can love people better by not talking about the definition of marriage, or not talking about sin, or not talking about repentance. But hang on. God loves us so much that he sent his son to die for us. He gets to say what's loving and what's not. And if in love, he is calling people away from sin, the most loving thing we can do is agree with God. And that's true on all of these subjects.
So good, Allie. Something that is interesting to me is that moms and women are particularly drawn to this message. So as a mom and as a woman, I think we have to be on guard, right? I mean, no offense, Joseph, but you guys have you're just better at being a little tougher. We see that with our kids all the time.
We're cruel. Like, it's true. No, my kids tell me that all the time. You just don't care. And I'm like, you're right. I just don't care.
I don't care about your feelings. Yeah, Mom, though, a little bit more we do. And I'm seeing this in terms of on abortion, which you've mentioned, immigration as well. But it's something that I want you to explain, that we can be both like Christ in our love for people that are hurting, but also acknowledge both victims. And you mentioned that. And I think that comes down to our worldview. So can you lean into the worldview? We all are created equal. We should care about the immigrant. We should care about the child. But let's flesh that out and what that's looking like and how policies can protect people. And we can be smart enough and nuanced enough to say, hey, look, immigration's a real thing. How do we protect everyone involved, including the women and children that we so deeply care about? How do we create a pro-life state so we make sure all the doctors know the difference between miscarriage management and an abortion? And we are doing that. The pro-life movement is doing that.
Yes. I like to say that politics matter because policy matters because people matter. Politics affects policy. Policy affects people. Mm-hmm. People matter. People matter to God. They matter to us. They're people made in the image of God. Politics is not the primary or exclusive way to love your neighbor, as I said, at the beginning, but it is a way to love your neighbor. I mean, I think abortion policy is one of the greatest and most tangible examples of this, that abortion policy can save lives, and policies surrounding surrounding abortion and pregnancy centers make a big difference on how these centers function and can serve women and children. Like we hear a lot via toxic empathy that the pro-choice side is the side of empathy and love, because you are allowing a woman to exercise bodily autonomy to make the right decision for her. We only focus on the woman. In fact, we call the baby that's involved pregnancy contents, or whatever they say, or the content of conception. And so that's completely dehumanizing an image bearer of God in order to make this argument via toxic empathy. But when I think about the work that pregnancy centers do, I think about a pregnancy center in Texas that always tells this amazing story. She told it on my show of this woman who ended up choosing life after going to Planned Parenthood and hearing that it was going to be $800. She went to this pregnancy center and said, I need a free abortion. And of course, they offered her love and resources. She kept her baby. And I'll try to shorten the story. It's really amazing. But she had her baby, and everyone from the pregnancy center right before she gave birth came into her home, filled her pantry and her refrigerator with groceries, set up a crib for her, set up a rocker for her. This woman ended up not only having her child, but giving her life to Christ when she dedicated her baby at this church that was attached to the pregnancy center. When she got center stage with her baby, after the pastor had told a little bit of her story, the entire congregation of this mega church just stood up and applauded her and welcomed her. And that's the people of God. That's what we do. And while God can do anything, no matter what the Constitution says, no matter who's in charge, and no matter what the laws are, the fact of the matter is, if you go to a place like California, where just a few years ago, where Kamala Harris was Attorney General, they had something called the Reproductive Fact Act that forced pregnancy centers to prominently advertise for free abortions when a woman walked in. And thankfully, that was eventually overturned by the Supreme Court because it was a clear violation of the First Amendment. But I think about that story that I just told in Texas. If they had had a law where free abortions were advertised when that woman walked in, would she have even made it through the door? Would she have even interacted with the staffers there who not only helped her save her baby, but through the grace of God, her heart was changed. Her soul was saved. She was baptized. Her baby was dedicated in the church. Policies matter. Policies really affect what we can do as people, how we can help people. It really affects people's lives for better and for worse. And so moving out from toxic empathy, you have to think, who is involved here? What is at stake from all parties? And then what is true? What is right? And what does the Bible say about these things?
Allie Beth, parents are, I think, many ways unaware of what is on the line this election. As I've talked to other mom friends, I talked to grandparents, they have no idea the tidal wave that's coming when it comes to progressive policies, the way schools have changed, medicine is changing. Flesh that out for us and wake them up, if you would, to what's going on if progressive policies continue and kids can continue to lead with their own feelings and all the adults around them give them toxic empathy and let them do some really dangerous, irreversible things.
Yeah, I think looking at what the Biden-Harris administration has already done, also looking to the state of California, which sometimes ends up being a bellwether. And of course, Kamala Harris is from California. And a lot of the policies there, the immigration policies, the so-called social justice, or I would call lawlessness policies, the policies that have to do with parental rights, or lack of parental rights in California were really championed by Kamala Harris. So I think it's fair to say, as someone who has been the border czar for the past 3.5 years, as someone who, as the district attorney of San Francisco and the attorney general of California, really pushed these sanctuary city policies that resulted in the murder of young women like Kate Steinle, that resulted in the harboring of not only illegal aliens, but illegal aliens who committed violent crimes. I think we can trust that, unfortunately, we will have more situations like Laken Riley. We will have more Kate Steinles. We will have more Molly Tibbetses. When you're looking at what the DOJ has done under the Harris-Biden administration, putting pro-life grandmothers in prison for standing in front of murder mills, I mean, that is already happening. That sounds like something that we would warn about, that it could happen one day. No, that already happened under the Harris-Biden administration. Of course, everyone will remember when the teachers union asked federal authorities under the Biden administration to dub these concerned parents at school board meetings domestic terrorists. I mean, that's what we're looking at. We're looking at the doubling down of the weaponization of the justice system against concerned parents, concerned citizens, people who dare speak up about their concerns about immigration or the sexualization of children. In California, it can be a crime to oppose your child's desire to quote unquote change their gender. You may well lose custody of your child if you say that you don't want your 12-year-old Sally to try to become Sam. And that's what we're looking at. That's Kamala Harris. Those are the policies she's represented. She literally said in 2019 to the ACLU, as reported by CNN, that she supports taxpayer-funded gender reassignment surgery for detained illegal aliens. I mean, that sounds like a Mad Lib. It's hard to believe that that's even true. She said that out loud in 2019. So that's the person that we're about to put into the White House. I would just urge people to really think hard about the policies that are represented.
Well, that sounds like a pork barrel spending that we would just like make up for an SNL skit. Like, oh yeah, things are gender in prison. We have money to throw around, but that's actual real policy. And like you said, her VP pick, Waltz, would do the same thing. If your kid came to you, parents, and said, I watched a TikTok, I now am trans and I need hormone therapies, and you said no, in his home state, your kid can be taken, the state can grant custody, take your kid and then give them all the hormones, irreversible surgeries. That's what's on the line. No one's slowing down and counseling. Yeah.
It's not hypothetical. That happens.
And we've heard it. You've interviewed people on your show, so I'd encourage people to listen to that. Listen, we've talked a lot about the fear. There's a lot of fear around what could happen if progressives win and this narrative continues. But talk to particularly women. We're busy. We have children, families, dads as well. But how is voting an opportunity for us to see hope for the future? How should we as Christians think theologically, especially I say as women, to vote when that's not something all women and Christian women have across the world? How do you shepherd that and just speak to guiding us as Christian women into November?
Yeah. Well, you know, one day Jesus is coming back and we won't have politics. We won't have elections. We won't have partisanship. There will be no more division, no more disagreement, no more sadness or sorrow or anything. And we are all looking forward to that day. But that day is not here yet. We are here in this physical context, in this temporal space, on this tiny speck of eternity, this small plot of the earth, here and now, for a reason. God does nothing accidentally. He does nothing arbitrarily. He does everything with intention and specificity. So you are where you are when you are for a specific reason. It's true for your children. It'll be true for your children's children. And that purpose in general is to glorify God and to do good for others and to share the gospel and to make the world around you better in the capacity that God has given you to do so. One of the ways that we can do that, one of the ways that we can, as exiles on this earth, as Israel was in exile in Babylon in Jeremiah 29, God tells them to seek the welfare of the city I have placed you in, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. We're exiles in this earth. Our citizenship is in heaven, but we are here, and in the welfare of the community around us, we find our welfare. One way to love your neighbor is through political engagement. The curriculum that's in your school, the abortion policies that are in your state, the crime policies that are in your community, they all have a real effect on people's ability to live and thrive. And so our political engagement, how we vote, really matters. It is one of the only ways, not the only, but one of the few ways that we really can affect change. So do your part and then trust God with the rest. We are not people who operate out of fear and paranoia. We are people who do the next right thing in faith with excellence and for the glory of God. And we trust that He wins in the end.
Allie, that's a great final thought, that we're going to do the next right thing. And I also want to encourage people just to be mindful of the fact that if we do not lead in November as the church, as the body of Christ, as His ambassadors for Christ here on earth, we will be led by someone else. And so those are the choice. We talk about the binary choices on the ballot. We also have a binary choice as the Church of God, that we will either lead the communities that we're in toward truth, toward goodness, toward virtue, toward righteousness, or we will be led, and in certainly in that case, away from those things. So, Allie Beth, thank you so much for your persistent voice and your joy, and that's a popular term, but it really, we do want to be joyful warriors because we know that we don't have to despair. Our hope is not in the election. Our hope is in Jesus, but we have some things to do in his service. And again, I want to remind people that the book, Toxic Empathy, How Progressives Exploit Christian Compassion, comes out October 15th, and I know you will benefit from that. So, Allie, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks so much.
And friends, we thank you for joining us here on Countdown to Election 2024, Countdown to Decision 2024. It's been a pleasure to be with you. We're going to be back with you soon for some more information, for some more equipping, and make sure that you can be all that God intends you to be in this season. I'm Joseph Backholm. We'll see you next week.